Today is the 20th episode of This Thing in the Mud, and it's always a good thing to take a step back and reflect on how far you've come when you hit a milestone like this. They say rejoice in small victories, and that's exactly what I'm doing. Hi, my name is Uncle Don, and this is a podcast called This Thing in the Mud, where we pick out a subject in the mud and try to clean it up for the next few minutes. When a friend asked me the other day what was the one significant decision that started in my heart and eventually manifested to reality, I immediately thought of this podcast. For a long time, I'd wanted to make this leap from writing short tales or stories to presenting a podcast where I could share everyday experiences in a few minutes. But I was afraid of failing. Now, excuses such as not having the proper equipment or not knowing where to begin kept my back against the wall. I'm not sure what happened, but after much procrastination and some friendly encouragement, I decided to give it a shot. See, the majority of you were relieved to learn that I had brought this to life, even though a lot of you don't listen frequently, but you still have no idea what you've done for me. It hasn't been easy, to be honest, but making this happen week in, week out has been a blessing, particularly in the area of research, writing, and reading. The ability to commit to a cause has taught me consistency, which has invariably impacted other aspects of my life. I can honestly claim that I have no regrets. Life itself is full of trials and errors, and when you try anything new, you will fall, learn, and improve at the same time. To those who are listening, I advise you to start something today, no matter how scary it may be. Your product may not be perfect at first, but you will undoubtedly learn a lot in the process of making it. And that is a word for someone today. Today, I'd like to reflect on the last 19 podcast episodes that I've released, as well as the lessons that I've learned and perhaps that you've learned from each one of them. Ironically, I talked about being intentional with your actions in my debut episode, which was themed intentionality and pride, and just like taking the first step in putting up this podcast. But the narrative was truly about a man who, because of his inability to manage his rage, wiped out virtually an entire community. You should give that a listen, trust me. My second episode, called Tribute to the Fallen, was about a colleague who died during the holiday. It was especially touching because we had only spoken a few days before she was gone. She was visually impaired, but could do so much on her own. It was a major turning point in my life, and I had to pay tribute to her. I also had to reflect on my life and the fact that young people can also die at any time in life. On the same episode, I also spoke about my friend who lost her mom through the pandemic. I couldn't reach her for so long. She had gone into this mood because of the shock that the death of her mom brought her. Her mom was a single mother, raising 2 boys and a girl, and I believe that this really was a big blow to her. Again, it made me reflect on my own family, and I remember what it felt like losing my old man in 2018. I thought about how I would be able to manage that process if such a thing was to happen to me again. And trust me, it wasn't easy. I thought about life. That was an episode for the books. The third episode was called Hamilton Flowers, a short story about the dangers of drunk driving. And my fourth episode was about the one dream every Nigerian is quietly having at the back of their mind, relocating to Canada. And that one was a charm. My fifth episode was titled Pure Water, and it was a story about a little girl faced with the dangers of hawking pure water on the streets of Lagos, managing the loss of her sister, and running away from prostitution. Polygamy was the subject of my sixth episode, which was titled Polyandry, an inside look at how a 21st century woman feels about having 2 spouses. I had a guest on the podcast, and we talked about gender roles being flipped. Childhood Fantasy was the title of the 7th episode, and it was one of my favorites. I mentioned growing up and a middle school crush that had my head running 360 degrees. This one girl that I admired so much that I believe I will share her story once again in the future. Because it was a week full of love and merriment, I created a Valentine special on my 8th episode of This Thing in the Mud. I had 2 guests on the show, then I asked them questions about their partners and what Valentine meant to them. On the 9th episode, I asked the question if there's less loyalty in relationships, less compromising, less patience, and if relationships were more selfish, more materialistic, and more egocentric. I titled the episode A Fickle Generation because I felt that this was the case. On episode 10, the conversation centered around ritual killings in Nigeria, a madness that is still running the streets lately. I titled it Fast Life. And in episode 11, we looked at the short story I wrote some time back about a man named Elder John who took advantage of a situation and battled with the outcome of it. I named the episode The Psychology of an Elderly Snake. In episode 12, it was time to talk about how my week had been and the many happenings that took place in the city of Lagos that week. I called it Everyday Lagos. The year 1995 was the title of my 13th episode, and it was a brief story about a young man who saw death through the eyes of numerous events that occurred before his fall. Episode 14 was inspired by my experience with the Super Eagles in the Abuja National Stadium, where they were unable to qualify for the World Cup in Qatar after drawing with Ghana. In episode 15, we looked at another short story about my encounter with my neighbor. It was a typical Niger story about how I had to get past my neighbor's constant noise from their generating set, also known as I Better Pass My Neighbor. The noise from my neighbor's yard was the title. The 16th episode was named Do You Believe in Reincarnation? And it featured reincarnation-related incidents and stories. On episode 17 of This Thing in the Mud, I took it a notch higher and spoke about why men are attracted to the female bum bum. This one was a little bit controversial, but it was an eye-opener. On episode 18 on the podcast, it was a shocking revelation of bestiality, which was on the news in Lagos. And I just had to talk about it because it was something that people needed to listen to. On the last episode of This Thing in the Mud, I called it A Date with the Dentist. And it sure was a painful one. I literally wrote this episode with pains in my gum last week. I had gone to see the dentist to take off a bad tooth, and I had to share the experience with my listeners. Today being the 20th episode of This Thing in the Mud, I thought it'd be nice to remind you all how far that we've come. You know, sometimes you delve into content on a weekly basis and you do not realize how much work you've put in until something happened and you're like, wait a minute. And so, in the spirit of being positive and for the sake of the next 20th episode, I would like to ask that you please spread the word and let everyone know about This Thing in the Mud. I'm just a passionate human being bringing beautiful stories to your ears. For the next 20th episode, I am hoping that I can do personal stories of events that I think you would like people to listen to. So be rest assured that I'll be in your DMs inviting you for my podcast as a guest. Again, thank you very much and have a good week ahead. May God bless your hustle. And that is what is in the mud. Ciao. If you enjoyed this episode of This Thing in the Mud, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop us a comment on our YouTube and social media pages. My handle is at uncle_don, and it is spelled UNKL_DON on Instagram and Twitter. See you next week. All my love. This Thing in the Mud, storytelling at its very best.